This is the largest massacre of Iranians in recent history.
Many of us cannot reach our friends or family, and it's kind of like one half of our world went dark in an instant. Not only is it one of the most brutal crackdowns in the history of the Islamic regime, but it's also just one of the most brutal crackdowns in our modern era.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Off the Record. This is a place where we take a step back from the noise surrounding the news and take some time to deep dive into the stories beyond the headlines. And this week, to say that there's a lot to unpack would be an understatement. It has been a very heavy couple of weeks for anyone who is paying attention to what's happening in Iran. Frankly, we should all be paying attention. When the protests initially begun a month ago now, I was really hopeful and inspired by watching people take to the streets and fight for their liberation. The 12-day war between Israel and Iran last June exposed just how weak this regime really is, and for the first time there was real hope because we saw that this regime can be toppled if enough pressure is applied. And now, seeing just how brutally the regime has cracked down on these protesters has been devastating. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has for the first time publicly acknowledged that thousands of people were killed during these protests, even describing some of the deaths as having occurred in the most inhumane and savage manner. At the same time, Khamenei blamed the United States for the deaths, more specifically, U.S. President Donald Trump, calling him a criminal. Regime officials, who've spoken to Western media with easy access to Wi-Fi, by the way, have labeled Iranian protesters as terrorists, blaming Israel and the United States for the uprising. Because of the internet blackout, there's still no way to verify the true numbers of people killed, but the Sunday Times did report that the regime's crackdown left about 16,500 people dead and over 330,000 injured. This is the largest massacre of Iranians in recent history. A UK parliamentary report states that it has credible sources indicating that some type of chemical weapon was used against protesters, resulting in more deaths later. It is also believed that at least 5,000 Iraqi proxy militia terrorists were imported to suppress the protests violently. What we've seen so far has been absolutely heartbreaking and devastating. There's footage of families having to search through hundreds of bodies to find their loved ones. There's footage of the regime brutally beating protesters and even entering hospitals to kill some of the injured. The regime is demanding that families pay 1 billion tomans in order to receive the body of their loved one, or have them sign a false confession in order to release the bodies for burial. A maximum of 3 to 4 people are permitted to attend a funeral. Protests have largely been violently suppressed, and Iran is essentially under a state of martial law. In most cities, regime forces are in military gear, patrolling the streets and threatening residents with loudspeakers not to assemble. Last week, when President Donald Trump encouraged protesters to keep going and said help was on the way, many believed the U.S. would carry out a strike, and yet for now, nothing seems to be happening. Is this just a ploy? Is the U.S. biding its time? Or is this yet another tragic and failed attempt by Iranians to free themselves from the shackles of this regime? The only thing we do know for sure is that the story is not yet over. So where do we go from here? Joining me today is a guest who brings expertise and personal experience to the conversation. We are joined today by Sarah Raviani, a political commentator and strategic communications professional specializing in Iran, the Middle East, and U.S. foreign policy. She has extensive experience across American, Iranian, Arab, and Israeli political circles with a background in legislative advocacy, grassroots organizing, and coalition building. Sarah has worked directly with Congress on national security and foreign policy issues, contributing to key legislative efforts including the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act, and amplifying Iranian American voices through policy analysis, media engagement, and public advocacy. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I want to first begin by expressing my deepest sympathy and condolences for what the Iranian community are going through, because I know that after October 7th, one of the things I really wish was someone to acknowledge the pain that we were going through as the Jewish community. And so I can't imagine what it's been like as somebody that is a member of the Iranian diaspora community right now. Can you please shed light for us on what you're going through, what your community is going through right now?
Our community is facing a very sad situation, watching from afar our people in Iran being slaughtered. And not only that, but the internet has been cut off. So there's a complete and total communications blackout. So many of us cannot reach our friends or family. And it's kind of like one half of our world went dark in an instant.
I can imagine how difficult that's been. Have you been able to connect with any family, friends, loved ones in Iran at all?
It's been very intermittent. We don't know how our family members are doing. Friends have completely gone silent. Social media accounts have completely gone silent. The little interactions that you experience on a day to day basis are just completely gone. The world feels a little bit darker and a lot quieter and a lot more lonely without that part of our world being connected to us. And watching what they're going through in the streets has been extremely difficult. And I want to stress just how dire the situation is. The people that are in Iran that have been able to connect to the outside world briefly have expressed just how dire and chaotic the situation is. And many of them are extremely traumatized by what they saw in the streets and the sheer brutality of what the regime has subjected their people to.
If we rewind to about a week ago, US President Donald Trump took to his Truth Social to encourage Iranians to keep protesting. And he said help was on the way. And in fact, all of us in Israel were bracing ourselves for the retaliation. We knew that a US strike would mean that we would spend the next several weeks in bomb shelters and underground bunkers, and we were ready for that if it meant to finally see the end of this regime. And it seems that we are at a standstill right now. Do you have any understanding of why this is happening? You know, what's going on? Is this a ploy?
This is very reminiscent to me of what happened prior to the 12-Day War, when there was a lot of confusion. We didn't know what was going to happen. And President Trump, I think, has been not as forthcoming with what his plans are in relation to Iran, because we kind of have to keep them on their toes. I think that that's part of the military strategy here, and that ambiguity is actually very an important element of surprise for the regime, so that they don't know what's coming next. And because of that, that's created a lot of hearsay. A lot of people are on the edge of their seats waiting for what happens next. And I actually think that that's a very important element of surprise.
Okay, well, I want to ask you about Iran in general, because now that it's in the media, a lot of people have become geopolitical experts. But even myself, I would say that I've heard from so many analysts that Iranians inside of Iran, for the most part, do not support this regime at all. But the reality is that the regime does have some type of support, which is why it's still in power. So can you give our audience a little bit of an understanding of what the makeup of the population is? Are there groups that are like, the MEK that are, even worse in some regards, if you want to talk about it? Or are most Iranians actually these secular people that want the regime gone? Give us a sense of the population of Iran.
So I would say at least 90% of the population does not support the Islamic regime. And in fact, many of them have become increasingly secular, especially the young Generation Z, who have completely rejected Islam as a whole. There is ideological support from the very upper echelons of the leadership of the regime, as well as the IRGC. But average, everyday people do not support the regime. And likewise, they don't support the MEK. The MEK has tried to create a sense of support through buying politicians and buying space in media circles. But the reality is that they largely reject the MEK and in turn actually support the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. And we saw that in the protests when the youth rose up, they were all chanting his name in the streets.
Right now, we have in Iran, you have the Basij, right, that I think are in charge of the imposing the sort of civilian, I guess, day-to-day crackdown. You have the IRGC, which is directly loyal to the regime, and you have the Iranian army. Can you give us a sense of everything in Iran regarding the, I would say, military apparatus? And is it possible, if we talk about toppling the regime in general, would we not need these three elements to also be either deflecting or toppled as well? And does that require more than just a strike in order to do so?
Absolutely. And I feel like that's the missing piece here that we haven't seen are military defections. And I believe that that support is not only ideological because the religion and the regime are one in the same. So abandoning one means abandoning the other. But the security apparatus is very vast. Like you mentioned, the Basij force is the paramilitary force. They're the plainclothes guards that walk the streets and patrol in usually civilian clothing. The IRGC is the terror apparatus that is basically the Hamas or the ISIS of Iran. Very, very, very similar. That is the force that really clamps down on the protests, and that's the force that you see going out there and just indiscriminately firing on civilians, including a 3-year-old little girl who was walking to grocery shop with her dad in a bazaar, and the IRGC just openly fired, shot her with a pellet gun, and she unfortunately passed away. And so that's the terror that Iranians are experiencing on a daily basis. Even just innocent young little girls are being killed by this regime. The Iranian army is a complete separate entity. It's technically still part of the IRGC, but there is not that ideological loyalty. However, they don't wield the same power that the IRGC possesses.
Interesting. And there has never been an interest by the Iranian army to want to actually defend Iranians?
I believe that there is, and we have seen defections here and there, especially on social media, where members of the military will come out and say that, they are with the people. But as far as a large-scale defection, we just haven't seen that yet. And again, I do believe that that is the missing piece here. And I do believe that that's where targeted strikes could really help in that effort to move it forward. If they see a decapitation in leadership, I believe that it will cause the lower levels of the security forces to defect. And I believe that that would really change the course of what we see happening on the ground in Iran. We need to see the security forces lay down their arms and stand with their people. Otherwise, we're going to see massacre after massacre where we've in this past few weeks seen just tens of thousands of people being mowed down by the regime. They stand from higher levels and they shoot down into the crowds. And those are the defections that we need to see, where there's an alternative. And those people see that if they defect and stand with the Iranian people, then they too can be saved from this brutal regime.
Speaking of a strike, which you and I have mentioned multiple times since we begun this conversation, I really want to address what I think a lot of people in the American left are worried about right now, which is foreign intervention and how that affects a revolution. Now, I have read in the past that foreign intervention is always something that if you want to suppress a revolution, then foreign intervention is the way to go, because it doesn't create legitimacy internally. And oftentimes it creates this like rally around the flag that a lot of people, once they begun to get attacked by foreign entities, will, feel like they want to fight back. And so I want to ask you, why do you think this time is different? Why would you think a strike would actually be effective? And why, how do we ensure that that we don't create this rally around the flag situation in Iran?
So I think that Iran is a very different um, country in the Middle East, particularly, but globally, we don't see very many countries like Iran where you have such a young, educated, brilliant population that really is yearning for change and also yearning to be free of the shackles of the Islamic regime. And so after the 12-day war, we did not see a rally around the flag effect. However, I do believe that people were a little bit confused because they thought after the 12-day war or during the war that people would come out into the streets and rise up against the regime. We did not see that, but I don't think that that's an indication that there was a rally around the flag effect. I think that in that instance, it was a very tense environment with the strikes happening, as well as the security forces heavily patrolling each corner of every street, making it pretty much impossible for the people to rise up. But I do believe that the 12-day war was very important because it showed Iranians both inside the country and outside the country that the regime is not as strong as it appears. It's actually a lot more fragile. And I believe that that led to what we saw in the past few weeks, where people did have the courage to rise up because they saw, the regime really isn't as strong as we think it is. So I believe that there are several levels where a foreign intervention, if you will, would actually be very important. And it would also give an opportunity for the people to rise up because the security apparatus would be dealing with external pressures. And I know that there's a lot of people who are opponents of foreign intervention and that they say, we shouldn't get involved. But the truth is that the Islamic regime has been at war with the West and with the entire region for the past 47 years. And they themselves have their own foreign intervention with their proxies like Hezbollah and the Iraqi Shia militias who have come into Iran by the busloads to suppress the people. So there already is foreign intervention, and we didn't start this war. The Islamic regime started this war on the day of its inception when it took dozens of Americans hostage during the Iran hostage crisis.
That's very interesting that you bring it up. I never even thought about how during the 12-day war, we didn't see this rally around the flag. So one of the main arguments, I guess, for people who are worried about that and pushing that argument is that we've already seen some version, some test case of the regime being attacked by a foreign entity. In that case, it was directly Israel. And they're Iranians. I remember seeing footage of them even celebrating while it was happening. So I think that's a very strong case that you just made. I want to ask you, if a military strike is off the table, what is another way that the entire Western world could actually support Iranians right now? For me, at the very least, every Western leader should be ensuring that their Iranian ambassador has been expelled. To make it very, very clear that we're not okay with this. What else could Western leaders be doing to support Iranians right now?
So, at the very basic level, I think that all world leaders should very much watch their rhetoric and be sure that they're supporting the people of Iran in the way that they speak. They don't understand just how much that matters to the people. And I know that there's a communications blackout right now, but when the Iranians are reconnected to the internet, I know that they're going to come back and they're going to see everything that each world leader had to say. And I know that that will make a difference in the future for them. So, at the very, very very bottom level, I think we need to see a very strong rhetoric in support of the people of Iran and against the Islamic Republic. Beyond that, economic pressure is very important. Here in the United States, President Trump's economic policy of maximum pressure towards the regime has really crippled the upper echelons of the leadership. And we've seen that even with the Treasury Secretary coming out this past week and noting that the Iranian officials are moving their money into offshore bank accounts, like in Dubai, for example. So economic pressure is extremely important. We've seen the rial drop to levels that are, extremely low, at zero, not even worth the paper that it's printed on. So I believe that that's very important, because at the end of the day, any economic relief only benefits the regime. And we've seen that time and time again in the past. So economic pressure, and then as well as in Europe, prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist organization, that's a very, very basic step that the UK can do. And the UK really does need to step it up and really apply pressure to the regime in an economic fashion, and also in their rhetoric. I believe that they're really falling short on that. And so I believe that the rest of the world should take President Trump's approach to the regime and really apply that economic pressure, provide words of support for the people, and hold the Islamic Republic accountable.
There's a lot of talk about, Reza Pahlavi, the former crown prince, or the son of the former Shah, to be a figure that would lead Iran if the regime were to topple, as some transition figure. But how do we ensure that within, after his term is over and democratic elections are being held, that it doesn't turn into what Hamas did in Gaza, or that it doesn't turn into another Syria? I know you mentioned that Iranians are, for the most part, very young and progressive, and they don't want to see this type of power. But how do we ensure that there isn't some vacuum that fills the void in the future?
So for the Crown Prince specifically, Reza Pahlavi, he is, I believe, an amazing figure to lead the transition. He's very patient, he's very even-tempered, and he really does listen to the concerns of those around him. And I think those are three qualities in a leader that we really should expect. And I also very much respect him for that. And so I don't believe there to be any issue with Reza Pahlavi as a transition figure. And the people of Iran, likewise, very much do support him. And so I believe that that would be just a match made in heaven. And also, we've seen the nostalgia. And I think that the people of Iran, especially the youth, they go back and they look at the time when his father and grandfather were running the country, and they see that the prosperity that was present. And we hear stories from our parents and our grandparents talking about the Pahlavi era and just how prosperous it was. And so I believe that if we give him a chance, that he could actually lead the country to greatness, and that he would open up the door for a referendum where the Iranian people could have a say in their own future. And that ultimately should be left up to the Iranian people, because they've been robbed of that right for so long to decide what type of governance and who they want to specifically govern them.
My last question to you is, I've seen the American far left and the woke right respond to the situation, and I'm definitely not surprised by some of their rhetoric. It's just very difficult to see what's happening in Iran and to see the complete silence from people that were so vocal about Gaza, not just in those movements, but in Hollywood, how mainstream the suffering, talking about the suffering in Gaza was, without the entire context of why that suffering was happening and who was perpetuating it. And then to see this complete silence on Iran, or this whitewashing of Maduro, the Venezuelan narco dictator that, thank God, is now in U.S. custody. What is your response to that and to those people?
It's very upsetting. especially as an Iranian American, when I see just the sheer brutality of this regime. We have to put into perspective, over a 48-hour period, tens of thousands of people were killed. And not only is it one of the most brutal crackdowns in the history of the Islamic regime, but it's also just one of the most brutal crackdowns in our modern era of a state just cracking down and indiscriminately slaughtering their people. So to see this complete silence is very frustrating, and it's honestly just sad. But I don't really expect anything different. For several years, even at the beginning of my advocacy for Iran, the pro-Palestine group was very hostile, and that's continued to this day. They threaten us. They are very nasty, and they're very mean, and the causes just don't align, because at the end of the day, what the pro-Palestinian people are chanting for is for basically essentially a continuation of Hamas. And who are the funders of Hamas? The Islamic regime. So they're two very opposing ideas. And I think that even some Iranians have had a hard time grasping that and realizing that they're really just not our friends, they're not our allies, and they're not on our side. And we can't look to people that have that very performative activism for any sort of support. And honestly, I don't really want them to support us, because their cause is not what I feel is a just cause. And the Iranian people deserve better advocates than what we see from those groups.
Well, the only silver lining here is that I think the relationship between the Iranian community and the Jewish community has definitely increased here. We had a rally here in Israel, and it was just beautiful to see the Persian Israelis come out and people from all walks of life come out. And so the same way that the Iranian community really came out to support us after October 7th, I hope your community knows that you have allies here. You have allies all over the Jewish community. And Sarah, I want to close off by just saying that I hope, in the coming months, we'll be able to speak to each other face to face, but in Tehran.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to thank the people of Israel tremendously for all of their support. And I really do believe that our historic friendship will continue, and it'll only just grow over time. And I'm very, very thankful for both the Israeli people and the Jewish community here in the United States for really standing up for the people of Iran in their darkest hour and showing us that kindness and that friendship, because it really is important during these dark times. So thank you so much.
I want to thank all of you for tuning in today on Off the Record, where our goal is to fight through the noise and get to the stories beyond the headlines. We'll continue to monitor what's happening in Iran, Israel, and the entire Middle East to keep you informed as things develop, and we are praying for better days ahead. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.